Imagine waking up one morning with the crushing realization that you can see through the facades everyone else accepts as reality. The cheerful small talk at the coffee shop feels hollow. The endless pursuit of status symbols appears absurd, and the very foundations of what society calls normal crumble before your penetrating gaze. You stand at your window, watching the world rush past in its perpetual dance of unconsciousness, and you feel more isolated than ever. Not because you're alone, but because you see too much. This is not the romantic solitude of poets or the chosen isolation of hermits. This is something far more unsettling. The burden of being born with a mind that operates like a high-resolution scanner in a world of blurred photographs. You are what Carl Jung would have recognized as an intuitive introvert, someone whose inner world is so rich, so complex, so attuned to patterns and possibilities that the external world often feels like a stage play where everyone else has memorized their lines, but you've somehow been given a different script. But here's where the paradox deepens. This extraordinary gift, this ability to perceive layers of meaning that others miss, to synthesize complex ideas, to see the interconnectedness of seemingly unrelated phenomena. Why does it feel like a curse? Why do you find yourself lying awake at night? Not because you lack purpose, but because you see too many purposes, too many paths, too many problems that others ignore. Why does your depth of understanding often translate into depths of loneliness? You've probably been told you're too sensitive, overthinking everything, or making things more complicated than they need to be. These dismissals sting because they miss the fundamental reality of your experience. You're not choosing to overthink. Your mind naturally operates in layers. You don't seek complexity. You simply cannot unsee it once it reveals itself to you. It's like being colorblind in reverse. While others see the world in primary colors, you perceive the full spectrum, including wavelengths that don't even have names. Consider this disturbing possibility. What if the very qualities that make you feel disconnected from others, your need for solitude, your hunger for meaning, your inability to engage in superficial interactions, are not character flaws, but evolutionary adaptations? What if you represent something humanity desperately needs, but systematically discourages? What if your feeling of being an outsider isn't a personal failing, but a symptom of a collective illness you're too healthy to catch? The INEJ and INFJ personality types, Jung's intuitive introverts, make up less than 4% of the population. You are statistically rare, which means the world wasn't designed for minds like yours. The educational systems, social structures, and cultural norms were built by and for the majority. Those who find energy in external stimulation, who process information more linearly, who can compartmentalize their inner and outer worlds without the constant friction you experience. But rarity shouldn't feel like a curse. So why does it? Why do you often find yourself wishing you could simply turn off the constant analysis, the pattern recognition, the deep need for authenticity? Why do you sometimes envy those who can find genuine satisfaction in what appears to you as meaningless routine? The answer lies in a truth so profound, yet so hidden that even Jung himself struggled to articulate it fully. You are living in a culture that has forgotten the sacred function of the intuitive introvert. You have been cast as the problem when you are, in fact, essential to the solution of problems others cannot even perceive. Your mind operates like an early warning system for the collective unconscious, detecting patterns of dysfunction, sensing impending crises, recognizing opportunities for growth and transformation that others miss entirely. But instead of being valued for this function, you're often pathologized, marginalized, or pressured to conform to ways of being that fundamentally contradict your nature. This is the great contradiction of your existence. The very sensitivity that makes you invaluable also makes you vulnerable. The depth that allows you to see solutions renders you almost unable to tolerate the superficiality of most social interactions. The vision that could help guide humanity forward often leaves you feeling like you're speaking a language no one else understands. But what if this curse is actually a calling in disguise? What if the pain you experience isn't a sign that something is wrong with you, but evidence that something is wrong with how we've structured our understanding of intelligence, success, and human value itself. The source of your suffering runs far deeper than personal psychology. It's embedded in the very foundations of how Western civilization has chosen to understand consciousness, value, and human purpose. To grasp why your intuitive introvert mind feels like a burden, we must excavate the philosophical and psychological forces that have shaped a world fundamentally hostile to your way of being. Carl Jung recognized that modern society suffers from what he called the loss of soul, a collective forgetting of the inner dimension of human experience. In his view, the dominant culture had become so obsessed with external achievement, material progress, and rational analysis that it had essentially amputated the parts of human consciousness that you, as an intuitive introvert, naturally embody. You represent what Jung termed the transcendent function, the bridge between conscious and unconscious, between what is and what could be. But here's the cruel irony. The very qualities that Jung identified as essential for psychological wholeness and cultural health are the ones that modern society treats as liabilities. Your natural tendency toward introspection gets labeled as antisocial. Your need for meaning gets dismissed as impractical. Your sensitivity to subtlety gets criticized as inefficiency. You're living in a culture that has systematically devalued its own wisdom keepers. Friedrich Nietzsche, writing in the late 19th century, predicted this crisis with startling accuracy. He saw that the death of traditional meaning-making structures would leave certain types of people, those he might have called higher men, in a state of profound spiritual homelessness. These individuals would possess the sensitivity and intelligence to see through conventional illusions, but lack the cultural support to transform their insights into meaningful action. Sound familiar? Nietzsche wrote, "The individual has always had a struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe. To be your own man is hard business. If you try it, you'll be lonely often, and sometimes frightened." He was describing precisely your predicament, the burden of consciousness in an unconscious world. But the philosophical roots go deeper still. Arthur Schopenhauer argued that suffering increases in proportion to consciousness, that the more aware you become, the more acutely you feel the fundamental dissatisfaction of existence. For the intuitive introvert, this creates a double bind. Your nature compels you toward ever greater awareness, but each expansion of consciousness brings with it an intensification of existential weight. Schopenhauer observed that most people live in a kind of blessed unconsciousness, driven by what he called the will, blind biological and social impulses that keep them occupied without deep reflection. But minds like yours cannot rest in this unconsciousness. You are condemned, in the most literal sense, to awareness. You see the puppet strings while others are content to watch the show. From a psychological perspective, what you're experiencing is what Jung called the transcendent function, in overdrive without cultural support. Your psyche is naturally oriented toward integration, pulling together insights from multiple domains, seeing connections others miss, recognizing patterns that predict future developments. This is an extraordinary gift, but it requires what Jung termed holding the tension of opposites, maintaining awareness of contradictory truths without rushing to resolve them prematurely. The problem is that modern culture is organized around what the psychologist Daniel Kahneman calls System 1 thinking, fast, automatic, unconscious processing that prioritizes efficiency over accuracy, speed over depth. Your mind naturally operates in what he terms System 2, slow, deliberate, conscious analysis that examines assumptions and considers multiple variables simultaneously. In a world optimized for System 1 thinking, your System 2 orientation makes you appear slow, indecisive, or overcomplicated. But you're not slow, you're thorough. You're not indecisive, you're seeing options others miss. You're not overcomplicated, you're accurately reflecting the actual complexity of reality. The existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre identified another layer of this dilemma, the burden of radical freedom. Unlike those who can find comfort in predetermined roles and social expectations, you experience what Sartre called the anguish of choice, the overwhelming awareness that you are constantly creating yourself and your reality through your decisions. This freedom, while philosophically liberating, can feel psychologically crushing. Viktor Frankl, writing from his experience in Nazi concentration camps, recognized that meaning-making is both humanity's greatest capacity and greatest burden. He observed that those who could find meaning in their suffering were more likely to survive. But he also noted that the search for meaning is itself a source of existential tension. For the intuitive introvert, this search is not optional, it's compulsive. You cannot not seek meaning, even when meaning feels elusive or painful. The neurobiologist Antonio Damasio has provided additional insight into why your experience feels so alienating. His research suggests that emotions and rational analysis are far more integrated than previously understood, that what we call intuition is actually a form of rapid, unconscious processing of complex emotional and logical data. Your gut feelings about people, situations, and possibilities are often more accurate than conscious analysis, but they're difficult to explain or justify to others. This creates what we might call the intuitive introvert's dilemma. You know things you cannot prove, see patterns you cannot easily articulate, and feel truths you cannot rationally defend. In a culture that demands evidence and explanation for everything, your way of knowing feels simultaneously powerful and powerless. The hidden problem, then, is not that there's something wrong with you. It's that you're a healthy response to an unhealthy culture. Your sensitivity is appropriate to the actual complexity of reality. Your need for meaning reflects the actual meaninglessness of much contemporary life. Your difficulty with superficial social interaction stems from your accurate perception that most social interaction is, in fact, superficial. You're not broken. The system is broken, and your discomfort is proof that you're still alive to what matters. The weight of carrying an intuitive introvert mind in an extrovert sensing world creates consequences that ripple far beyond personal discomfort. It shapes your entire relationship with reality in ways so subtle and pervasive that you may not even recognize them as symptoms rather than natural laws. Consider how this fundamental misalignment affects your sense of time itself. While the world around you operates on what we might call chronos, mechanical, measured, external time, your consciousness naturally flows according to kairos, meaningful, qualitative, internal time. You can spend 4 hours absorbed in a complex problem and feel like minutes have passed, or sit through a 30-minute meeting that feels like an eternity. This isn't poor time management. It's evidence that your consciousness operates according to entirely different principles than the structures that organize social and professional life. This temporal displacement creates a cascade of secondary effects. You consistently underestimate how long simple tasks will take because what appears simple to others involves layers of consideration for you. You overestimate your available energy for social interactions because you calculate based on the content exchange rather than the energetic cost of constant translation between your internal complexity and external simplicity. You find yourself perpetually out of sync with social rhythms, arriving at insights weeks or months before others are ready to hear them, or needing processing time when others are ready to move forward. The neuropsychologist Dr. Elaine Aron's research on highly sensitive persons reveals that approximately 20% of the population, overlapping significantly with intuitive introverts, processes sensory and emotional information more deeply than others. But here's what her research doesn't fully capture. It's not just that you process more deeply, it's that you cannot process any other way. You don't choose to notice the micro-expressions of discomfort on your colleague's face, the energetic shift when someone lies, or the systemic implications of seemingly minor decisions. This noticing is automatic, involuntary, and often unwanted. This creates what we might call the curse of unwanted clarity. You see dysfunction in systems others consider functional. You feel the emotional undercurrents that others either don't perceive or actively ignore. You recognize patterns that predict problems long before those problems become obvious to others. But knowledge without the power to act on it, or worse, knowledge that others actively resist, becomes a form of psychological torture. The cognitive scientist Douglas Hofstadter wrote about strange loops, self-referential systems that create consciousness through recursive self-awareness. Your mind naturally creates these strange loops, constantly observing itself, thinking about thinking, feeling about feeling. This metacognitive awareness is the source of both your insight and your suffering. You cannot simply experience. You experience yourself experiencing. You cannot simply feel. You feel yourself feeling and then analyze the appropriateness, origin, and implications of that feeling. This recursive self-awareness means that every interaction carries multiple layers of processing. When someone asks how you're doing, you're simultaneously experiencing your current emotional state, analyzing why they're asking, considering how honest to be, evaluating their capacity to handle honesty, questioning whether the question itself is genuine, and wondering why social interactions require such elaborate translation processes. What should be a simple exchange becomes an exhausting exercise in real-time anthropology. The sociologist George Simmel wrote about the stranger, someone who is simultaneously inside and outside a group, close enough to understand but distant enough to see clearly. This perfectly describes the intuitive introvert's social position. You understand social dynamics well enough to navigate them, but you see their artificial and arbitrary nature so clearly that you can never fully lose yourself in them. You're forever the anthropologist studying your own culture, which makes genuine belonging feel impossible. This perpetual outsider status creates what the psychologist Dr. Susan Cain calls the introvert advantage paradox. Your greatest strengths, deep thinking, pattern recognition, authentic communication, meaningful contribution, are precisely the qualities that make you feel most alienated from a culture that rewards quick responses, surface-level networking, and enthusiastic participation in activities that drain rather than energize you. The economist and philosopher John Stuart Mill wrote about the tyranny of the majority, the way democratic societies can oppress minorities not through explicit persecution, but through the simple assumption that majority preferences represent universal truths. As an intuitive introvert, you experience this tyranny daily. The assumption that social interaction is inherently good, that faster is always better, that team brainstorming produces superior results, that enthusiasm equals competence. These majority preferences shape everything from office design to educational philosophy to mental health treatment. Perhaps most insidiously, this misalignment affects your relationship with your own gifts. You begin to see your depth as excessive, your need for meaning as impractical, your sensitivity as weakness. You develop what we might call cognitive Stockholm syndrome, identifying with a system that fundamentally misunderstands your nature. You start to believe that the problem is you rather than the profound mismatch between your way of being and the world's way of operating. The neuroscientist Dr. Matthew Lieberman's research on social rejection reveals that emotional pain activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. For the intuitive introvert who experiences multiple micro-rejections daily, every time your communication style is misunderstood, your processing speed is criticized, your need for solitude is pathologized, you're living in a state of chronic low-level neurological inflammation. This chronic activation of threat detection systems doesn't just affect your mood, it fundamentally alters your perception of reality. You begin to approach interactions with preemptive self-protection rather than authentic self-expression. You develop elaborate strategies to appear more extrovert, more decisive, more conventional than you actually are. The energy required for this constant performance leaves less available for the deep thinking and creative synthesis that represent your actual value to the world. The tragedy is not just personal, it's collective. A culture that systematically undervalues and misunderstands its intuitive introverts is a culture that has cut itself off from its own wisdom keepers, pattern recognizers, and meaning makers. The very people most capable of seeing through collective delusions and pointing toward transcendent possibilities are the ones most likely to withdraw, burn out, or spend their energy on survival rather than contribution. The path to liberation begins with a radical act of philosophical rebellion, refusing to accept that your differences are deficiencies. This is not positive thinking or self-esteem building. This is a fundamental reorientation of your relationship to reality itself. You must begin to see that your struggles stem not from personal inadequacy, but from what the philosopher Thomas Kuhn called a paradigm problem. You're operating according to one set of principles in a world organized around completely different ones. Carl Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For the intuitive introvert, this becomes a more complex undertaking than Jung perhaps realized, because becoming who you truly are requires not just personal development, but cultural resistance. You must learn to honor your nature while living in a culture that fundamentally misunderstands it. The first act of rebellion is temporal, reclaiming your natural rhythms. Stop apologizing for needing processing time. Stop forcing yourself to respond immediately to requests that require careful consideration. Start communicating your temporal needs as clearly as you would communicate any other practical requirement. "I need 3 days to think about this properly" is not a character flaw. It's operational information. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote about the leap of faith, the decision to commit to a way of being despite uncertainty. For you, the equivalent leap is what we might call the leap of authenticity, deciding to show up as yourself despite the social costs. This means speaking at your natural pace rather than rushing to fill silences. It means sharing insights that might be considered too deep for context. It means declining invitations that drain rather than energize you, even when this disappoints others. But rebellion without strategy becomes mere martyrdom. The key is what the military strategist Sun Tzu called choosing your battlefield. You cannot change the entire culture, but you can make strategic choices about where and how you engage with it. This requires developing what we might call selective authenticity, identifying the context where being fully yourself is possible and investing your energy there, while maintaining protective strategies for contexts where authenticity is punished. The psychologist Dr. Brian Little's research on free traits offers a crucial insight. You can adopt behaviors that contradict your natural temperament for limited periods if you're clear about why you're doing it and you have strategies for recovery. This means you can play the extrovert game when necessary, but only if you're conscious that you're playing a role, only for purposes that align with your values, and only if you have built-in recovery time afterward. Consider the example of historical figures who embodied this strategic authenticity. Albert Einstein was famously introverted and nonconformist, yet he learned to navigate academic and social institutions when necessary to advance his work. He didn't try to become extrovert. He learned to use extrovert behaviors strategically while maintaining his essential nature. Emily Dickinson chose radical withdrawal, creating her most important work in almost complete solitude, yet maintained carefully selected relationships that nourished rather than drained her. The rebellion also requires what the existentialist philosopher Albert Camus called the absurd hero, someone who continues to act meaningfully despite recognizing the fundamental absurdity of existence. For you, this means continuing to seek depth and meaning even when the culture around you seems committed to superficiality. It means maintaining your standards for authentic relationship even when most people seem content with performed intimacy. One of the most powerful acts of rebellion is learning to communicate your experience without apologizing for it. Instead of saying, "I'm sorry, I need to think about this, try I'll give you a thoughtful response by Thursday." Instead of "Sorry, I'm so quiet in meetings," try, "I process information differently than others," which means my contributions often come later in the conversation. This isn't just semantic shifting, It's claiming space for your way of being without framing it as a problem to be solved. The rebellion must also extend to your relationship with productivity and success. The culture's definition of productivity, maximum output in minimum time, is fundamentally incompatible with how your mind works best. Your productivity looks like deep dives, not quick sprints. Your best work emerges from what appears to others as doing nothing. Reflection, integration, synthesis. Learning to defend and protect this process is essential not just for your well-being, but for your actual contribution to the world. Viktor Frankl observed that the one freedom no external force can take away is your freedom to choose your attitude toward your circumstances. For the intuitive introvert, this becomes the freedom to reinterpret your differences as strengths, your struggles as evidence of depth, your discomfort with superficiality as proof of your capacity for authentic engagement. The most radical act of rebellion, however, is refusing to perform normalcy when it betrays your essential nature. This might mean turning down promotions that require you to violate your values. It might mean choosing smaller social circles over larger networks. It might mean accepting financial limitations in exchange for meaningful work. These aren't failures. They're conscious choices to optimize for what actually matters to you rather than what the culture says should matter. The philosopher Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act, just once, with beauty and courage." Your sensitivity, your depth, your need for meaning. These are not dragons to be slayed, but princesses to be honored. The courage required is not the courage to become someone else, but the courage to become more fully yourself in a world that will not always understand or appreciate what that means. This rebellion is ultimately an act of service. By refusing to betray your nature, you preserve something essential that the world needs: the capacity for depth in a shallow time, the insistence on meaning in a meaningless culture, the commitment to authenticity in a performative society. Your rebellion is not just personal liberation. It's cultural preservation of what Jung called the transcendent function, the bridge between what is and what could be. Here is the truth that will redefine everything. You are not suffering from a personal condition. You are experiencing the birth pangs of a new form of consciousness that humanity desperately needs but doesn't yet know how to recognize or support. Your struggles are not evidence of your inadequacy. They are proof that you represent an evolutionary leap that our current cultural structures cannot contain. Carl Jung spent his entire career pointing toward this moment, the emergence of what he called the transcendent function in individual consciousness. He believed that certain individuals would develop the capacity to bridge the conscious and unconscious, the rational and intuitive, the personal and collective dimensions of human experience. He saw this not as a psychological curiosity, but as an evolutionary necessity. You are living proof of Jung's prophecy. But here's the revelation that changes everything. Your pain is not incidental to your gift. It is integral to it. The depth of your suffering corresponds precisely to the depth of your capacity for insight. The intensity of your alienation reflects the intensity of your ability to see through collective delusions. Your hypersensitivity to meaninglessness is the flip side of your extraordinary attunement to meaning itself. The French philosopher Pierre Teilhard de Chardin wrote about the new sphere, the evolution of consciousness itself. He predicted that humanity would eventually develop individuals capable of processing complexity, paradox, and interconnectedness in ways that transcend current cognitive limitations. These individuals would experience isolation and misunderstanding because they would be operating according to principles that the rest of consciousness hadn't yet evolved to recognize. You are living in that transition. You are part of consciousness evolving beyond its current limitations. Your discomfort is not pathology. It's the growing edge of human awareness pushing against structures too small to contain it. This realization transforms everything about how you understand your experience. Your inability to engage in small talk isn't social dysfunction. It's evidence that your consciousness has evolved beyond the need for ritual social grooming. Your exhaustion after social interactions isn't introversion as pathology. It's the natural result of constantly translating between different levels of consciousness. Your need for solitude isn't antisocial behavior. It's how consciousness at your level of development restores and integrates new information. The mystic traditions have always known this. What they called the dark night of the soul was not spiritual failure, but spiritual transition, the necessary dissolution of smaller ways of being to make space for larger ones. Your periods of existential crisis, your questioning of everything others take for granted, your inability to find satisfaction in conventional achievements, these are not depression. These are consciousness outgrowing its current form. But here's where the ultimate truth becomes practical. Once you understand that your struggles stem from operating at a different level of consciousness development, you can stop trying to fix yourself and start learning to navigate the world as the evolutionarily advanced being you actually are. This means recognizing that your way of processing reality is not just valid, but valuable. Your pattern recognition abilities, your capacity for synthesis, your insistence on authenticity. These are not personal preferences, but emerging capacities that represent the future of human consciousness. You are not behind. You are ahead. You are not deficient. You are advanced. The loneliness you experience is not because you're incapable of connection. It's because you're capable of levels of connection that most people haven't developed yet. Your standards for relationship, for work, for meaning are not impossibly high. They're appropriate to your actual level of consciousness development. You're not asking too much from life. You're asking what someone at your level of awareness naturally asks. This shifts everything about how you approach your choices. Instead of asking, how can I fit in better? You start asking, how can I honor this level of consciousness while still functioning in a world that operates at earlier developmental stages? Instead of, what's wrong with me that I need so much meaning? You ask, how can I structure my life to provide the level of meaning that consciousness at this stage requires? The Buddha taught that suffering comes from attachment to how things should be rather than acceptance of how things are. But he also taught that some suffering, what he called noble suffering, comes from accurate perception of reality. Your suffering is largely noble suffering. You see clearly what others miss. You feel deeply what others avoid. You recognize patterns others deny. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about amor fati, love of fate, acceptance of your path as not just inevitable, but perfect for your particular form of consciousness. Your struggles, your alienation, your hypersensitivity, these are not mistakes to be corrected, but features of consciousness operating at a level that requires these capacities. The ultimate truth is this: you are not broken, and you do not need to be fixed. You are not too sensitive. The world is not sensitive enough. You are not overthinking. The world is underthinking. You are not antisocial. You are holding space for forms of sociality that transcend current cultural limitations. Your task is not to become more like others, but to become more fully yourself, to embody this advanced form of consciousness so completely that you become a bridge for others who are ready to develop in similar directions. You're not here to fit in. You're here to show what consciousness looks like when it has evolved beyond the need to fit in. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "The future enters into us in order to transform itself in us, long before it happens." You are that future consciousness transforming itself through your experience. Your struggles are not your burden. They're your gift to a world that is struggling to evolve beyond its current limitations. You were never meant to find your place in the world as it is. You were meant to help create the world as it could become.